Welcome to Current Situation, your Palmetto State political pulse. I'm your host, Joshua Gale, alongside South Carolina State House Representative Jordan Pace. Every week, our goal is to help you navigate the complex world of politics through biblically conservative perspectives. Today, we're joined by podcast host Phoenicia Miracle. Phoenicia is launching in the year 2026 here in the spring a podcast called Shuck Beans, and we're going to ask a couple questions about what is Shuck Beans, but also our conversation topics are going to be around the efficiency and effectiveness of philanthropy versus government assistance, how Appalachian communities built communities without dependence on government. Before we jump into today's conversation, we're going to hear a message from this episode's sponsor. Hi, I'm Joshua Gale, founder and designer at Val & Vine Jewelry. Here at Val & Vine, we understand marriage the way God designed it, a covenant rooted in unity and purpose. We also believe that jewelry is part of His design. We see it throughout creation, and we see it mentioned in the beginning of the Bible, beginning in Genesis. Gold is representing purity, diamonds representing radiance, and rings signifying commitment and covenant. At Val & Vine, our work blends this reverence with modern fashion and refined design. Every piece of jewelry is crafted with intention, guided by education, and delivered with confidence and kindness. At Val & Vine, every experience begins with a simple phone call. Whether you're just needing fashion and style guidance, or you're wanting to create something custom and uniquely yours. Whether you're envisioning a custom engagement ring, style guidance, or a meaningful gift, our goal at Val & Vine is to make your journey personal, clear, and enjoyable. So take your time, explore our collection, and when you're ready, schedule a commitment-free call with one of our team members. There's nothing we can't design together.
Welcome back to The Current Situation. Phoenicia, we met a few weeks ago, and you told us a little bit about yourself and about podcasts. But if you could just, share with our listeners who you are, what's your background, and what led you to this point of saying, I want to tell my story, and then what in the world are Shuck Beans?
Well, thank you, Jordan, and thank you, Josh. It's really an honor to be here on Current Situation. And I'll just start with your last question, Shuck Beans. So if you're from Southern Appalachia, the Southern Mountain region, you might know Shuck Beans as leather breeches. And basically, it's a way of preserving food and before refrigeration. So the families took the green beans, which were white half runners usually, and strung them up. Hung them up then in a cool, dry place. And by Thanksgiving or by the fall, we had dried beans, which you then simmer for a long, long time with a big chunk of fat back pork. And they're absolutely delicious. And currently I live here in South Carolina in Charleston. And so you certainly don't find Shuck Beans on anyone's menu. I bought them this year off of Facebook from a friend back in Harlan, Kentucky, which is where I'm from. So that's the answer to that question. And then related to the philanthropy piece, I began my career in fundraising in the year 2000. I had been an English teacher for about 10 years and transitioned into fundraising. And through that transition, I definitely saw the effectiveness and really the efficiency that private giving can have on a community. Because when people are able to make donations from their discretionary revenue, when I have enough money left over at the end of the day because I've had low tax, an affordable housing system, when I'm in a community that's really working well, as an American in a democracy, I have the money left over to give where I want to give it. And so I've worked for a hospital, music festival, food bank for several years. So I've definitely seen what private philanthropy can do. So I would also go on to say that growing up in Appalachia, and Shuck Beans is an excellent example of one's ability to plan ahead when you're not depending on someone else to take care of you. I think because of the isolation of the mountains also because of the Protestant work ethic. The fact that so many Scots-Irish came there, English came, and many of them had already fled Europe because of some kind of religious persecution. And they brought with them a real love and patriotism for this country. As many, many books have recorded, Appalachians by far outnumber any other people group that volunteer for the military in America. And so you see that love and that concept that nobody took care of me in England. Nobody took care of me in Scotland. Nobody took care of me in Ireland. Nobody took care of me in Germany. And so here I am, and my mom's people were there in Harlan County for over 200 years. And that concept that we need to work and then give of what we have to others, mostly through our churches at home. And then once I left Harlan and went into philanthropy as a career, I saw the work that charitable nonprofits do in the community. As I often said when I was a consultant in fundraising, in philanthropy, if you haven't proven that you're going to make good use of the dollar, your nonprofit won't last very long. So that doesn't happen in government. The government just asks for more or taxes more, but the nonprofit world definitely has to give an account of their outcomes and how much of your dollar actually went to prove that what we promised you was going to happen does happen.
Yeah, I've always done research on that to make sure that what percentage of that contribution goes there, because you're actually doing a transaction, you're handing in a check or something like that. Obviously, I always say if we had to hand in a check with our tax dollars from our paycheck, we would care a lot more about where those dollars are going, but we do more research on the nonprofits we're giving to than we do our state house representatives in the budget there. I was down the street, ran into a gentleman the other day in front of Kusal, this area of Somerville over here. I had seen reports on different Facebook pages. I used to live in Park Circle, so I first saw it there in Park Circle. There was a gentleman setting up a nonprofit booth soliciting donations for abused children. So that person began to do research on that table and that nonprofit, which was founded and based out of Atlanta, Georgia. And when they confronted the nonprofit who benefited children in Georgia and asked them why they're in South Carolina soliciting money that only helps abused children in Georgia, why it was a reputable 501c3, it did have the 501c3 accreditation and number. It was highly strange that why are you here moving around Charleston? And so after being confronted, the gentleman did not have an explanation or answer. But when I ran into him in front of Steel City Pizza, I saw people just walking by, dropping in $20 bills, and without any wonder of who is this nonprofit and what are they giving to. So it's very strange that sometimes we care more about researching that than we do where our tax dollars going, which are funding some things that we wouldn't want funded either, that do not benefit the citizens of our own state. So that's a good point there. And how much of that percentage? Is it 10% that goes to there? Is it 10%? Why are the administration fees higher for some organizations than others? So those are all important questions and things to see when giving to organizations. So getting back to the statement about Appalachian communities, building, without a government assistance, without government overreach, without government dependence, because when nobody shows up to help, I think there's something innate within us that we want to survive. We want to thrive. We want to be okay. We want to serve and help each other. It's within us. But we've actually become a society with extremely dependent on government assistance and government, relying on the government to step in to fix things. And one of the scariest quotes ever, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. That is not good news, but can tell us about the communities relying on one another without government dependence.
probably the most recent example in Appalachia that we have are those horrible, horrible floods that happened as a result of the hurricane that came through here or through the Carolinas and hit Asheville. And you certainly see there that, you've got mules carrying goods to families. You have other churches. I gave to a church in Kentucky that was then making donations to buy some temporary housing, some trailers for families in Asheville. And so there's definitely that belief that if I don't have it, I can ask my neighbor for it. And I'll give you an example out of my own life. When I was 10 years old, our community flooded. I remember standing in our field in rural Harlan County, and the rain never stopped. And I stood there with my dad, and I watched the Cumberland River as it came up the back side of our property, which we had about 18 acres there, and the property had a hill on it. And my dad never believed that the water would peak over that hill. Right. And so what he did is he owned several businesses, and he had a what we call a ton truck. He took our ton truck to our neighbor's house because they lived in the lowland along the Cumberland River, and he loaded up all of their furniture onto his truck. But the rain never stopped. And the next day, the rain peaked over that hill. By then, my sister and my dad and my mom were carrying some bricks and cinder blocks out of our barn, and we were setting our own furniture up because Dad started to be concerned. And by the third day, they sent me to my grandmother's house along with my sisters, and the floods filled our 13-foot basement and came about 2 feet into our house. Until my mom sold the house, we had furniture that still had flood marks on a lot of it.
Wow.
And the neighbor's house, by the way, washed away.
Oh my God.
But you think about that. At that moment, we were relying on each other. I went to my grandmother's. My dad had my neighbor's furniture on their truck. But I will say this because I don't want to ever pretend that the government's assistance doesn't help in times of need. Came into our community following that. I remember standing in a long, long, long line as we were in line for a check to get some assistance after the floods. And for the first time in my life, I can remember going to JCPenney's and buying brand new towels. Wow. And I definitely remember. And so that was the first time, the only time that I ever personally experienced what I would say was the private plus the public assistance that really helped people get through that entire situation. And when the flood mud finally receded or the waters receded, you know who was in our house cleaning out the mud were church members. And, and so again, you came together. I will, and jump in here, Josh, at any minute, but one thing that I have seen in the last 20 years when I have, as a professional fundraiser, is that sometimes we who are so self-reliant, and I would have to put myself in that category, it's easy to look at someone else and say, well, why can't he do it? Why can't they pull themselves up by their bootstraps? But we don't know the background of everyone.
No.
And so that's why it's so, so important to go back to what you said, to look at the nonprofit. Is this a reputable organization that's helping people in my community? And how are they deciding whom they're going to help? And then give to your church or to your local nonprofit, your local food bank, those organizations that you know are doing the outreach, because we're not called to judge why people are in need. We are called to give of what we have in order to help people in need. And that's why I support what Jordan believes totally, and that is in a conservative perspective on taxes. The more money that I'm left with, that I've earned, then the more generous I can become in ensuring that the people in my community are actually assisted in and not just my community, my state, even around the world. we're able to give when we see needs on television and we hear about the needs that are caused by hurricanes and floods and fires and volcanoes. But if I don't have the money, if it's all has been sent to Washington, then I may not be able to even do the good that I want to do.
Correct. And that reminded me of, whether or not, a neighbor helps you out or somebody else can help themselves. Psalm 27:4, one thing that I have asked of the Lord that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent, and he will lift me high upon a rock. And I just look at that verse, and I want to be the person that is one thing that I ask, one thing that I seek after is to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to dwell in the courts of the Lord forever. Because if I'm being fulfilled by the Lord, every single thing, he's meeting every single need. He's my trust. He's my shelter. He's my rock. He is every need and desire, expectation. Everything is being met by the Lord. Everything else is a garnish. If it works out for me, it's a garnish. It's a cherry on top. But if it doesn't, I have every single thing that I need. I think we've lost a people that have understood and felt that way, that everything else was a garnish on top, that we're not entitled to anything. And we need to manage our expectations, that if my friends show up and help in this way, it's a garnish, it's a cherry on top. If the government does show up and it is helpful and it does work out, it's a cherry on top, but it's not something that I'm guaranteed. It's not something that I need in order to feel fulfilled or satisfied or taken care of or served in any way. And then Paul reminds us that we love and we serve out of reverence for God, not because we're being served really well, not because we're being loved really well. So that's all really important. And then as you were sharing as well, it just reminded me of, I think one of our conversations, you shared with me about an elderly gentleman, an elderly pastor who someone tested. They called a bunch of different organizations and churches, and they said they needed money for formula. Can you tell me a little bit more about that story?
Yes. So the pastor is Reverend Dunbar from Somerset, Kentucky. He has pastored a Church of God there for many, many years. And about a month ago, and this was all over social media, an influencer, a young woman, decided to pretend that she was a mother in need, that she pretended that she had a baby that had run out of formula. And she called many, many religious organizations, and she recorded the conversation so that she could then, make her case. These organizations were generous and represented Christ. And I guess she was going to say the others didn't. But whatever the case, when she got Reverend Dunbar or Pastor Dunbar on the phone, he was very, very compassionate. And as I said to you, Josh, that day, one thing that I see throughout Kentucky, throughout Appalachia, is if I have two of something, if I have two cakes and you want one, I'm happy to give you the other cake. If you ask me for the money to go bake the other cake, that might be a little more difficult to come by.
Right.
Mr. Dunbar asked her, what kind of formula does your baby need? How much formula does the baby need? In other words, he was representing the love of Christ and the sympathy and the empathy that we as Christians should have, not by promising to send money or stop at the church and I'll give you $25, but how can I help you actually meet the need that you currently have? What can we do for you? So that story went viral, and his church has received thousands and thousands of dollars from this influencer's followers who know that the heart of this man is with those who are downtrodden, those who may have fallen behind in some way. And that represents who we should be as Christians. I think it certainly represents the best of Kentucky, which happens to be my home state. But Southern Appalachia includes a teeny tiny part of South Carolina and some of Georgia, and then up through Virginia, Kentucky, maybe a little bit of Pennsylvania, certainly at West Virginia. So it continues to go up. But in those Southern Appalachian states, So often, the idea of going hungry, especially in the early 90s, I think about my own grandfather who was sent to an orphanage in 1906, I think it was. The idea of being hungry is still part of the conversation. People can remember stories of a grandfather who was hungry, or of the Great Depression when there wasn't much food, of trying to garden on a mountainside where it's very, very difficult. Their hunger is still relevant, is what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's present, but I'm saying it's definitely still relevant. And so when she called Pastor Dunbar, he came right in and said, yes. And really, Josh, that's a good segue into Shuck Beans. Those authentic, positive stories that come out of Appalachia, out of people who have had transformations, who have studied their ancestry and know what a blessing it is to be in this country, who understand the history of the region, the values of the region. They're all of the stories that I want to highlight on Shuck Beans. I'm not interested in the stereotypes and the pathos and, oh my goodness, our coal land was taken, because you know what? My coal land was taken. And I've done enough ancestry work now. I can see the deeds. And when I say taken, none of my ancestors who signed those deeds could read or write. So they just have X's. Then I have family members who say, well, we don't know if those were really our family members' X's. And that's the truth. But we can either look back and become angry, or we can look forward and be so grateful for the opportunities we've been given in this country and say, God, how can you use me? How can you use my story? And that's really what I'm not saying that Shuck Beans is always going to be a positive spin on everything, because I know the reality isn't always sunshine and daisies. But I am saying that my goal is twice a month, the second and fourth week, launching in February, is to promote how things are done, the rituals and the traditions and the humor, the music, the food of Appalachia that we're proud of and that we can present to the world and say, this is a strong, resilient group of people.
That does carry a lot of weight and a lot of meaning to it, because difficult times produce strong people.
Yes.
I feel like we are in a place now where we have a generation that's coming, and we're understanding that there's an entitlement. There's a level of this, that things shouldn't be hard, and things don't need to be hard anymore because we have automation. We have artificial intelligence. We have all these, we're becoming weaker and weaker and weaker. But the Bible promises the opposite of that. The Bible doesn't say that things will be easy and wonderful. It actually promises in John 16:33 that there will be tribulation, but take heart that I have overcome the world. Holding to that and understanding that, but it produces a type of person that will persevere, that has the skills to survive, can overcome, and understood the meaning of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that hunger, I don't think many people have ever experienced hunger to where
That's right.
it is haunting to feel hunger that much. So, all the way back to the story of the woman calling for, if she wasn't here in Charleston and she would have called the Low Country Pregnancy Center, they would have given her formula.
Yes.
And so this is that reminder. If you can donate, have formula, get the free packages of formula, any of those things, donate those to the Low Country Pregnancy Center. There are plenty of people who are looking for formula. It is expensive. It has gotten more expensive. And anytime the government tries to make something affordable, it becomes extremely expensive. Well, how is a powdered protein substance becomes so expensive? Even a can about this size, more expensive than an entire container of protein that I take after the gym, is become more, a tiny can has become more expensive than a large container of protein for an adult, which also can be considered a meal substitute. When the government tries to make something affordable, it becomes extremely expensive through greed. Why Walmart is our food pantry for the entire United States of America. They've signed an agreement, SNAP, everything. So when we start to subsidize food more and give out more benefits for food, why would they not increase the cost of foods to reap as much of that? We know we're gonna have this many billion in profit this year because of food stamps or SNAP or whatever it may be. Surgery, healthcare, another example.
That's
I
right.
had LASIK eye surgery before the pandemic. I didn't, thank God, wearing a mask and glasses was the silliest thing in the world. I'd see people's glasses fogged up all the time. And, but I had LASIK eye surgery, and Dr. O'Day is a great one here in Charleston, does so many surgeries. Carrie Sullivan's one of them, or Solomon. LASIK eye surgery is extremely affordable because the government's never tried to make LASIK eye surgery affordable.
Mm-hmm.
They've never tried to get involved in it. And therefore, the doctors have never increased the cost of LASIK eye surgery to be greedy and say, oh, if the government's going to pay for it, they're going to subsidize it. LASIK eye surgery is now $10,000 rather than $1,500 to $3,000 for a single eye surgery. The same thing for healthcare, the same thing for food. Anytime the government gets involved in trying to make something more affordable, it becomes extremely unaffordable. And so, Jordan, we've, started to begin to cover, the different things of hunger and needs and how difficult times produce strong character.
I think, childcare has become a big issue in, especially people our age and
Oh, yes.
younger that are starting to have kids, and use it as an excuse for people not having kids. And childcare costs so much. But one of the things that we discovered, like you were saying, Josh, the unintended consequences of government trying to help
Subsidize.
They'll subsidize, and then this movement for like what they call universal 4K. One of the people running for governor is trying to push this. Well, the economic reality is childcare, like childcare centers, the professional, like the big corporate size places, they don't make any money until the kid's 3 years old. The one infants especially are loss leaders essentially, and they break even mostly on like the 2-year-olds. It's the 3 and the 4-year-olds especially, because the ratios are different. They can have less workers per child when they're 4 because they're more self-sufficient. That's where they actually make enough profit to be open. So with the government helping, they're making childcare even more unaffordable by closing these centers and then hyper-regulating home daycares out of existence. I wonder if you could, like, in Appalachia, without any of that, how did people take care of their kids? Like, what was childcare like in that circumstance?
I'm 59 years old, so I haven't lived at home since I was almost 20. So I can't speak to what it's like today, but I can obviously say when I was growing up, childcare was a family business. My grandma helped. My dad had the businesses. And so I love this story, and I don't know if it really answers your question, but my dad's store was in town. And so we lived out in the country, but we went to the city school. Because he drove us up there every day with him. When we got out of school, we walked to the store. Depending on the age, I can remember sleeping, in beds of men's work clothes. Oh, the big piles of men's work clothes that he had. Well, you don't know. But anyway, obviously coal mining was the main profession there. And so we sold a lot of rubber steel-toed boots and 99-cent work shirts and 99-cent work pants. And then but it really, really was a family business. Jordan, there's something else though that's in line with this that I can say I have relevant experience in. I went to public school, K through 12. For 2 years, I was in a private college, but then I ended up graduating from Western Kentucky University. And I only bring that up to say that when our medical and then eventually I lived in Savannah, Georgia, where everyone I knew had children in private schools. And the idea that I now have to make at least $10,000 per year per child to pay for that private school is actually because the federal government and the state government have taken our school systems and turned them into these liberal banks of individuals who have one single goal, and that is to teach children the complete opposite of what they're being taught at home regarding who they are as a creation of God, regarding God's plan for their life and their future. And so you take all of those concepts that have now been integrated into public education and say, okay, we've just driven out thousands of families from this system. That's because the federal government got involved and allowed these things to happen. So when we look at healthcare and what's happening in healthcare, when you saw that huge exodus from public school, I have traveled enough to know there will be that exodus. It is already happening. When you've been in fundraising as long as I have, most of your donors are already part of some type of private medical care that involves them not having to become part of the public system. And so once again, when we get involved in ensuring there's socialized medicine for everyone, and the line to see my primary care physician is down the street and he's going to give me 8 minutes. You know what the wealthier families in our state are going to do? They are going to go to these boutique medicine clinics and they are going to hire their own private practitioner. And so what it does is it creates a decline in care, just like you've seen the decline in the public school system. And so I think what people don't realize when they push, I'm entitled to all of these things, is that once the money is spread so thin that everything is covered, no one is covered, and those who can leave. And so you're left with something far inferior to what you thought you were going to get before the government became involved in it. And that's what I keep saying to my husband. I worked for 8 years in the county hospital system fundraising in Savannah, and private philanthropy was so important there. But in no way, shape, or form was that hospital built on a socialized system except for one department, and that was the ER. And there are federal laws that say when you walk into an emergency room and declare, I'm having an emergency, then I have to be treated. And there you saw what happens when the supply does not meet the demand. And so then you go down there to the ER on any given night and the whole place is full. That doesn't happen because everyone's sick. It happens because the federal government has implemented a law that creates that crisis. So that's where we have to be careful. That's why, again, going back to private generosity and private philanthropy, and privately taking the resources I've been given and sharing them in places that I trust and have confidence in is such an important Christian leaders, I believe, in our state.
And sadly, it was Saint President Ronald Reagan that actually that instituted that. Most Republicans
Saint President Ronald Reagan. That's right. You are right. I think our mental health issues also land with his administration, which I regret saying and don't like to say, but so much of what we see in city parks today is the fallout of the federal government trying to solve a problem that should have been solved locally.
So Jordan, we don't have a South Carolina fully funded emergency fund. We have different nonprofits, different groups around the state being funded by the state budget.
We have
hoping that they're ran correctly, up to what standard, we don't know. But why do we keep putting earmarks and things in budgets when we do not have a plan for our own state in an emergency situation?
You're talking about like a natural disaster emergency?
Natural disaster. I mean, we saw it in North Carolina. There was not a nest egg. There was not a plan. We had to wait for federal relief. My brother is a consultant as in emergency management, and he goes to townships everywhere. He's been in North Carolina for the past several years, cleaning up and working with each small town who doesn't have the city manager, or the town doesn't have the personnel to be able to even to refile the paperwork and receive the federal funding. So then part of your tax-paying dollars is paying the consultant, who's then getting a percentage of the money that's coming in to help the city to receive the funds that were given to them in the first place, to make sure that they do get them and get in line to get them. So, we're not looking out for our own, but yet we are not chasing our tax dollars down to see where the money's going.
Yeah.
And it's going to be an emergency situation where we're to blame.
There's two reasons for this. And now I'll give you a comparison in a second. So the first reason is what we've been talking about. With the institution and the expansion of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, states have increasingly relied on the feds because it's there. There was a time when there was no FEMA, or when FEMA was itty bitty, teeny tiny. So by its just existing, it creates a reliance on it. And then FEMA is operated primarily on money we were borrowing that we don't have. So that's part of the reason. The other part of the reason is a lack of leadership, frankly, from the governor's mansion. Emergency response falls under the executive branch. There's not a whole lot in South Carolina constitutionally that falls under the governor's office, but that is under his purview. And unfortunately, the solution over the last few years under this current administration has been to create this thing called the Office of Resilience, or the Office of Resiliency, which, I don't know, at least a quarter, if not half of what they do is focused on climate change and not emergency preparedness and that sort of thing. It is an extremely opaque and not transparent agency. Like, I've asked all kinds of questions and gotten very little in response. The comparison to that is DeSantis in Florida. They know they're going to get hurricanes all the time. And when they had that one, especially a few years ago in Cape Coral down near Naples, DeSantis, because he's a strong leader, they had a plan. They got people out. They had minimal human life loss. And I think it was within like a month and a half of that bridge to the island being wiped out, they rebuilt the bridge. Like, done. So those two things together, federal government pushing reliance on it, on just by existing with FEMA, plus a lack of leadership, that's why we're at where we are. That's why we are where we are. The good news is we're going to have a new governor in 2028. I don't know who's going to be. I hope it's Ralph Norman, but we're going to have a new governor, and there'll be an opportunity to fix that.
Yeah. I would agree with that statement. It is over here on Dorchester Road where I'm at. We're overdue for an earthquake. And if you look at the fault lines in South Carolina, the entire road itself of Dorchester Road, which is a long road all the way from the peninsula down in Charleston up to Somerville, to the ponds where Highway 17 alternate intersects, is a fault line. We're overdue, no plan. That would isolate a lot of people from that are next to the river from being able to access, life-saving care, so it's, there's so many of those things that I think Georgie said that the heater went out. When it's an emergency like that and you've got children and there's no heat and it's less than 30 degrees outside, and you try to call an HVAC company, they give you the maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day, get your blankets and your wool socks. Thankfully, you got a guy, somebody, you call the friend and say, hey, I need you to come look at this, put me at the top of your list. But nobody's going to show up, and we have county emergency management groups, but I've seen how they operate as well. And it's overwhelming. And so I think it's really important also to know your neighbors, know your community, develop a community where you can rely on one another, because there will become a time where we have to rely on one another. And I want that opportunity. I found a recording of an earthquake in Horry County. And this was like the fact that we even had the recording was taken years and years later on a phonograph. And so like somebody remastered the phonograph recording, is one of the earliest recordings we have in South Carolina. And this gentleman, he was explaining what happened. He was a school teacher. And he's explaining everything that happened. And he said the cries, these screams, these shouts for God save us, please God save us, holding on to trees, people out of their mind, had never experienced an earthquake before. This was a disastrous, the earth was opening up.
That's crazy.
It was the way he tells the story was just crazy. I'll try to find it and put it in the show notes as well, because it's really, really interesting to hear. And his Southern accent is pretty incredible. When something that we've never experienced like this before, we go back to some of the hurricanes that we've had here. What was the biggest one? Hugo. People were hoarding and selling ice and, making a fortune off selling ice. And what was it, 2 weeks without power during Hugo?
For some people, yeah.
For some people, people still have some PTSD about not having power for 2 weeks and what a struggle that was. And people that rely on that for breathing machines, rely on it for
Yes.
all sorts of medical conditions and sometimes heat, some of those basic necessities. And people don't have a plan. They've never had to live without these necessities. They don't know how to start a fire. They don't know how to be able to provide for themselves because they've always been taken care of and they've always had it. And so it will be a more rude awakening when a natural disaster happens in 2025 or 26 than it would be years prior, where people did have some necessary skills. People knew their neighbors. People had to go borrow from things. People had to have a conversation. And now we'd survey a neighborhood and people wouldn't know even a 20th of their neighborhood, and see each other at the store and not even know that they share the same street address. So it's a rude awakening, but there's hope that there's something within us that is innate or that we've learned from previous generations that we can come together as communities. We can survive and thrive. If people have done it before, we can do it again.
And Phoenicia, I'm looking forward to hearing stories about that on their upcoming podcast and inspiring us with some stories of how it's been done before and how we can do it again.
Thank you both very much. I'm excited about this and certainly happy to be in a state, Jordan, where you're representing a district very close to me, not the one I'm living in right now, but thank you for all that you're doing to make this state such a desirable place to live in. And my husband and I have been in South Carolina for 5 years, and we've very, very much enjoyed it. And so I hope to bring maybe I'll have to cook a pot of shuck beans some night and have you all over for dinner so you can get the sense of it. I took some pictures at Thanksgiving. Yeah, that sense of resilience, I think now that I think about it, is in the shuck bean, right? Yeah. If you've got bags of beans, and my grandma who had all of her canned goods were in the cellar that was built into the side of the mountain. You always had something, regardless. You didn't depend on electricity, so it didn't matter if it went out, right? I think hopefully we are becoming more aware that we need to become more self-reliant, even while enjoying the wonderful blessings that we have here in this state.
Yeah. Absolutely. So that's shuckbeans.com, ShuckBeans.com. Phoenicia, what is the other name for Shuck Beans?
Leather breeches.
So you may have heard it by that, but now you'll never forget it, and you'll have some more insight into that area of our fine country. So visit shuckbeans.com to learn more about this upcoming podcast, again, that's coming out in February. You're in the midst of scheduling guests and kind of getting some episodes queued up for the big release. But if you want to learn more about it, we'll put the information in the show notes about Shuck Beans. We're thrilled to have that podcast to add to our playlist of some new, fresh content that we have not been able to find or see anywhere else. So we're excited about that. Jordan, I know that we're here at the end of 2025. What are we looking forward to early in 2026 as far as the State House is concerned?
State House is reconvening January 13th. So guard your wallets, hide your money. We'll be in session until May. And I think there'll be a lot coming out pretty quick. Okay. So we'll do an episode about that.
Yes. Check back here at Current Situation. We've got some episodes we'll be releasing in a timely manner here in 2026 to keep you updated what's happening in the State House and how you have the responsibility to follow your dollars, your soldiers. So I like to call my dollars soldiers. You follow your soldiers and their responsibility for what good that they're going to bring here in the state of South Carolina. And so keep up with that here from Current Situation. And thank you for tuning in. And we look forward to sharing more with you coming in the next few weeks.